Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, on a remote Scottish island, a man disappears without trace.
It became quite clear quite quickly that there was possibly something suspicious.
The tight-knit community turned detective to help solve the mystery.
You can imagine there's not that many people in Sandy. Someone will know something.
And forensic evidence suggests this isn't a missing persons case. It's a murder.
We now had significant findings, and the police were more than content to consider this to be a homicide investigation.
This is Forensics, Catching the Killer. Police Scotland's headquarters in Inverness, the nerve centre for all police inquiries across the country's Northern Highlands and Islands. In the summer of 2009, Mark Chernikevich was a detective sergeant based in the city. Crime in the capital of the Highlands provided the bulk of Mark's work, but a call to police in early June that year would end up taking him to the very extremes of his patch.
About 20 to 11 at night on Monday, the 8th of June, police were phoned about a missing person, Bob Rose, and that came from a member of the public who was concerned that Bob Rose hadn't been seen over the last couple of days. Bob had actually arranged to meet friends on Sunday for lunch and hadn't turned up, which was really unusual.
That call had come from Sunday, a remote island in the Orkney chain that lies off the far northwestern tip of the Scottish mainland. With a population of under 500 inhabitants, it's a place where people know each other's business.
They'd carried out some local inquiries themselves on Sunday and Monday. On Sunday, and hadn't been able to find Bob, and they were really concerned about him, and they didn't, he hadn't planned to leave Sandy as far as any of them were aware, and in fact he'd actually said he'd look after a friend's animals during the course of the week.
So just who was Robert Bob Rose, and where had he gone?
Bob had moved up about 18 months before June 2009, and he'd moved up to Sandy to make a fresh start. So he'd bought a small house there, and he was just looking to live the island life, I think. It was a big move he'd made, from one sort of area, completely new lifestyle. He'd left his family behind. He had adult children that were still living down in England.
Author Lynn Anderson was herself captivated by the Northern Isles, living on Orkney for several years and also setting one of her crime novels on Sunday. She understands how people are drawn to its sense of solitude and isolation.
For whatever reason, it may not be a terribly bad reason. They just want to sort of reinvent themselves in some way, and maybe they're running away or trying to get away from the city or family, who knows? But they have a sense that they can, you know, be more alone, not be seen to the same extent, when in fact the exact opposite is true. So people are very keen to find out that somebody's there to live and they're going to be part of the community because that keeps communities, remote communities, alive. So you're going to be much more interesting and they're going to be much more interested in you than perhaps ever happened in the city.
Despite being an incomer and an Englishman too, it did seem that Bob had integrated himself into the local community on Sunday in the short time he'd been on the island.
Bob had a number of friends, and it was a good social scene on Sunday. People, they know each other's movements, they know when each other are going off to Kirkwall or going away on holiday, and it's so small, everybody knows each other's movements, and that's perfectly normal.
You can't leave the mainland unless you get on a boat or get on a flight. So it's actually not possible to disappear. I mean, in a bigger expanse like the Highlands, maybe you've gone walking and they can't find you. You know, something happens to you up in the hills. But not on Sandy. You're not going to get lost in a mountain.
It was really unusual, and it became clear quite early on just the lack of sightings of Bob over the last couple of days.
With no police officers based permanently on Sunday, islanders worried about Bob began to conduct their own search.
The person that had phoned it in was actually asked if they could maybe just have a drive around and just see if they could find Bob's vehicle. And he did actually find it about 2 o'clock in the morning at Loth Pier.
Loth Pier, at Sunday's southern tip, is the main ferry terminal for anyone arriving or leaving the island by boat. Parked up was Bob's car, and while there was no sign of Bob, there were witnesses to how the car came to be left at the water's edge.
Somebody drove the car there, but then it wasn't him. People notice things because your neighbours are such a big part of your world. So you can imagine there's not that many people in Sandy. Someone will know something. How can you disappear?
That witness report about someone other than Bob driving the car would now escalate the police's involvement in the case.
So we started off carrying out a missing person inquiry. During the course of that, it became quite clear quite quickly that there was possibly something suspicious in Bob's disappearance.
The question now for detectives was just who was driving the car. And had they done something sinister to Bob Rose? Midsummer 2009, and on the remote Scottish island of Sunday, police and locals are searching for a missing man. Bob Rose had last been seen on the night of Saturday, 7th of June, drinking in a pub before heading home. He hadn't been seen since, and now both locals and police detectives were concerned that something terrible may have happened. So far, the main lead detectives had to go on was finding Bob's car parked at the ferry terminal. It's possible he might have left it there to catch a ferry on foot to the mainland, but inquiries suggested he'd never caught a boat off Sunday.
So one of the things we were keen to do was to find out where Bob Rose's Land Rover was and where it had been. So we carried out a number of inquiries, and we had information from witnesses that about 9 o'clock on the Monday morning, Stephen Crummock had been rummaging in the back of Bob Rose's Land Rover, and also that he'd driven the Land Rover to Loth Pier, he'd dropped it off there, and that Jack Campbell had picked Stephen Crummock up and they'd both driven away from the pier.
Sandy is a very strong community. So, you know, when I knew that had happened, I mean, my first thought was, you've got to rely on the people. The people will have been watching, the people will have all the backstory, the people will fit things together, and they will absolutely want to find out who did this, because it's a stain on their community. Every bit of information knitted with other bits of information. They were the investigative team in the first place.
The tight-knit community had identified the two men acting suspiciously. One was Stephen Crummock, who lived next door to Bob and had been seen drinking with the missing man on the Saturday in Kettletoft village. As had Jack Campbell, the second identified by eagle-eyed locals. But just who were these men, and could they reveal more about what happened to Bob?
So Stephen Crummock and Jack Campbell had both moved to Sandy about 3 years before. Stephen Crummock had bought an old Baptist church and he was going to be renovating that. The renovation was very slow, and Jack Campbell, he was breeding monkeys for financial gain. So he had a big setup at his house with cages, and all the monkeys were outside essentially in cages, and he would breed them and sell them. They weren't known to each other before that, but they all became friends and they would all drink together.
They might have been drinking buddies, but scratch the surface and the relationship between the three, especially Bob and Jack, had simmering tension.
There was a history of bad blood. We had evidence that Bob Rose had been in a relationship with a former girlfriend of Jack Campbell, and we know from witnesses that Jack Campbell was really angry about this. And in fact, when we went back and spoke to some of the witnesses, Jack Campbell had actually said to other people that he would kill Bob Rose.
Jealousy over a love rival wasn't the only motive detectives discovered.
Bob Rose was in a fairly healthy financial position, and Jack Campbell and Stephen Crummock were both in financial difficulties. So we know that on Saturday evening, Stephen Crummock had had a bit of a fallout with Bob Rose in the Kettletoft pub, and witnesses told us that was essentially because Stephen Crummock was not paying his way in terms of buying rounds of drinks, and had actually fallen out with Bob in the pub and had stormed off.
Police now had a motive as to why the two men might want to harm Bob Rose.
There's clearly a degree of suspicion forming around about Bob's disappearance now, and this is really about getting a trained team up there, of detectives, forensic staff, to get up to Orkney, to go over to Sandy, and to carry out more in-depth inquiries as quickly as possible.
Without a body, proving the case against Crummock and Campbell would be tricky. Could forensics help Mark and his team find the evidence that proved Bob had been murdered?
My first impressions when I arrived was this is a very remote area and a very special type of community. And I arrived on a day where the sun was shining and the sky was blue. We were looking at the beaches that were amazing. The sand was so bright and white sandy beaches. It really didn't come across to me as being a location where something of criminality, such as, a murder of somebody, it really stuck out as being at odds with that.
Forensic biologist Sarah Jones' first task was to examine Bob Rose's car, which had been left at the ferry terminal. And early indications pointed immediately to foul play.
So these are some photographs that were taken of the Land Rover Discovery that was Robert Rose's vehicle. And we had photographs taken to show the blood staining that was in the rear of the vehicle, and the samples that we took some photographs of those stains, and we sampled some of this blood from within the boot area of the vehicle to try to establish from whom the blood could have originated. It could have been animal blood, bearing in mind that Robert was a crofter and he had animals. So I carried out a test, an immunological test for the presence of human blood, and I got a positive result from that test to indicate that the blood in the rear of the vehicle was human in origin.
The sheer quantity of blood found in the boot suggested this hadn't come from a minor injury.
So the findings in the rear of the Land Rover Discovery really moved the inquiry from being a missing person to something where there was criminality. And the police were looking at this now in terms of a homicide investigation.
And Sarah discovered more forensic evidence inside the car that pointed towards murder.
We found a blood smear on the door card of the driver's door. So this was on the door handle, and that pointed towards someone having wet blood on their hands and handling the handle of the driver's door, and that blood matched the deceased Robert Rose.
DNA from Stephen Crummock had also been found on cigarettes in the car. Given what forensic investigator Sarah had discovered in the boot, both Crummock and Jack Campbell were now being interviewed by police as suspects rather than witnesses.
Jack Campbell was interviewed on a number of occasions when he was detained at Kirkwall Police Station. He point blank refused to answer any questions. He just said no comments to everything we were asking of him. And we've got a large quantity of blood in the Land Rover, but we don't have a body. In order to successfully prosecute this, we really need Bob Rose's body.
Once again, Bob's car would become the focus of the inquiry.
The Land Rover appeared to have damage to the underside of it, and it also appeared to have large quantities of sand in various areas, sort of on the underside and around the sides of the vehicle. So the Land Rover was fitted with running boards on the side, and they were piled with sand. So we were quite happy the vehicle had been either on a beach or off-road, but it had been significantly off the road, and we needed really to try and find out where's this vehicle been, you know, what's been happening, where's it gone.
But could another forensic discipline help detectives discover where the car had been driven?
I'm a forensic geoscientist, so what we do is we look at earth material, whether that be geological material, soil, or any vegetation or material that's adhering within that soil. And we look at that on vehicles, people, tools, anything like that. The police noticed that the car had a particularly unusual pattern of material adhering to the outside. There was a lot of sandy material along the running boards of the car, and there was distinct splashes up the side of the paintwork. Indeed, there was a lot of material on it. It had recently been deposited, and they thought this was rather suspicious. So they phoned me up in Aberdeen and asked if we could come up and have a look at it. What the police were asking was if we could actually identify where Bob's vehicle had recently driven over. So by looking at the material that was adhering to his vehicle and the pattern of that adherence, we could work out where it had recently been.
There's a reason why Sunday earned its name after all. Professor Dawson's first task was to help detectives narrow down the search area.
So the island of Sandy consists of about 20 square miles. Now, of that land, what we need to do is exclude the areas that do not share the characteristics of the material that we found on Bob's vehicle. So we can very quickly exclude all these blue areas here. It's not a clay soil. We can exclude all the brown earth, all the orange-coloured soil here. And we can know that it must be from these areas here, the calcareous sandy beach deposits. So we can very quickly narrow it down from that 20 square miles to less than 1 square mile of area that we can prioritise the search to.
The soil mapping helped focus the search to a select number of beaches.
The police were then able to go to those beaches and collect reference material from them and bring them back to where we had to make makeshift laboratory facilities in the local police offices. So by carefully looking at them under the microscope and testing their pH with a tiny little micro pH meter, we could very quickly exclude several of the beaches that they did not share the characteristics of that question sample, that unknown sample, the sample that we did not know where it came from. And very quickly we could narrow it down to this particular beach here at Stywick. So along here is Bracascale Bay, and just beyond it, over the horizon, is the Stywick Bay. And that was where the samples from the vehicle matched the sample of that particular bay, which shared those characteristics of size, grain shape, grain colour, and the little bits of shell sand that was still in that particular sample. So Stywick would be the bay that we would prioritise the intensive search to carry out.
Professor Dawson's work had helped police pinpoint the exact beach where Bob Rose's body might be located. As search teams prepared to scour the sands back in Kirkwall, detectives interviewing the two suspects would also have a breakthrough.
Stephen Crummock gave a version of events that Jack Campbell had killed Bob Rose outside Brayhower, which was Bob Rose's home address.
In 2009, police were investigating the suspicious disappearance of Bob Rose, a Yorkshireman who had moved to the remote Scottish island of Sanday 18 months earlier. Detectives suspected Bob had been murdered and were questioning two men, Jack Campbell and Stephen Crummock, drinking companions of the missing man. Although both initially denied involvement, during police questioning, one of them would reveal more of what had actually happened to Bob.
Stephen, as I understand it, had been on the island for about 18 months to 2 years and had attracted a nickname from the locals, which was Sludge Guts. That may have been due to his diet and his penchant for a can of lager, but that was certainly what they called him.
And when Crummock found himself knee-deep in trouble, he turned to Glasgow solicitor Ian Moyer for help.
I think people think that Glasgow traditionally has had a tough image, you know, gang fighting and all that sort of stuff, and heavy gangsters and so on. So I think people from more rural areas, if they're in big trouble, think those lawyers must have the most experience and fight the hardest. So Stephen was a very big man, physically big man, and he had come up from Yorkshire. I think he'd done various jobs in the past, using his hands, you know, a handyman. And he was doing up a property on the island of Sanday. I think he'd probably been there a couple of years. And he was a very straightforward person. There was no side to him. You could read him like a book.
Like Bob, the remoteness of the Orkneys had attracted a lot of incomers to the islands in the mid to late noughties.
Apparently that was to do with the fact that if you did an internet search for cheap property in the UK, the Orkney Islands outlying parts were the cheapest, and people thought that they could come up there and live on their benefits and have a property and leave all their problems behind them. But of course, oftentimes people bring the problems with them. And it's fair to say that the case completely divided the people of Sandy. The people who had lived there for generations were extremely unhappy that the suggestion was that people had come in and caused this to happen on the islands.
Stephen Crummock's account to police suggested it was his friend Jack Campbell that had killed Bob at his home. Could a forensic examination of the house confirm Crummock's version of events?
So following on from the examination of the Land Rover, I was asked to attend here on the island of Sandy and to examine Brayhower, which was the croft in which Robert Rose was living. So here we are. This is the chapel that was the home of Stephen Crummock. And here on the right-hand side is the croft in which Robert Rose was living. And you can see it's all boarded up.
The tumble-down two-room shack with no electricity has remained untouched for over 12 years.
You know, maybe he had been happy here. It certainly is remote, and it takes a certain person to live in a place like this, and particularly in the conditions that were inside the croft. I don't suppose it was a lonely existence. I don't know. But it just felt quite sad.
Crummock claimed Bob had been assaulted outside the property by Jack Campbell. So Sarah's first task was to determine if this could have been true.
The forensic examination outside, we didn't find any blood staining. So we'd been given some information from the police that there had been a scuffle outside of the property. So we looked for any evidence of an assault there, and we didn't find any blood staining on the ground, on the path leading from the road up to the entrance to the property.
Instead, the scene examination inside suggested this was where Bob Rose had been viciously beaten.
We found blood on the pillows, blood on the bedsheet, and blood on the nearby bench. We now had what we believed to be the site of an assault.
Tests proved the blood on the bed to have been from Bob Rose. But this wasn't the only blood found at the crime scene.
There was DNA evidence found within the property in the form of blood on one of the pictures above the head of the bed. So this was a photograph in a frame above the head of the bed, and on it was a blood smear. That blood smear matched Campbell.
For detectives interviewing the two suspects, forensics were crucial to determining what really happened at Bob's home.
From our forensic examination of Bob's house, we know that there was a lot of blood on his pillow on the bed, and we believe that is where the asphyxiation has taken place. We believe that Bob was attacked on his bed by Stephen Crummock and John Campbell. During that, Bob's become injured and he's bled significantly onto his pillow, and he's been asphyxiated and murdered on the bed. The workaround about Brayhower was able to discount the version of events put forward by Stephen Crummock.
Forensics had disproved Crummock's original story, but he would soon offer investigators more concrete evidence during questioning.
So we got a big breakthrough during the interviews of Stephen Crummock when Stephen said that he would take us to where the body was.
That location was Conninghole, an area close to the beach at Stywick Bay that Lorna Dawson's forensic examination of the sand had pinpointed.
Stephen explained that although he hadn't killed Bob Rose, that himself and Jack Campbell had taken Bob's body to Conning Hole and had buried Bob in the beach there. So this was a major breakthrough in the investigation, and as a matter of urgency, we had to charter a boat and get across to Sandy and take Stephen Crummock to the site.
During the 1-hour journey on a police launch, Crummock rarely spoke.
During the interview, you intimated to us that you would take us and show us where the remains of the missing person, Robert Rose, are currently buried. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until he reached Stywick Bay that he made a dramatic revelation.
Can you identify to me from that post the area where the body was?
Straight over.
Straight over from that, and how far from that?
That's it.
Just straight over there.
Stephen Crummock pointed to a large area of sand. This was about 50 metres by 20 metres, and he pointed over the fence and almost couldn't bring himself to get any closer, and sort of said, the body's in there. And it wasn't a small area that he was indicating, it was a really big area, which would still be an enormous task to search that. So in order to kind of narrow that down, we put in a cadaver dog, which is trained to sniff out the human body, and the dog scanned the area and indicated on a patch of sand, which really gave us a good starter for 10 and gave us a really good indication as to where we should start our excavation. This is a hugely significant moment in the inquiry. This is confirmation that Bob is dead from one of the accused. This is showing us where the body is, so that then gives us a whole load of forensic opportunities.
Forensic geoscientist Professor Lorna Dawson remembers the operation to locate and then retrieve Bob Rose's body.
In midsummer 2009, it was the most beautiful weather. The sun was shining, the beach was pure white, the sea was deep blue and green, and the waves were white and pure. And it was to contrast that with the fact that this horrible deed had been carried out on this island, and that Mr. Rose was indeed found buried in these dunes. It just didn't seem right in such a beautiful place that such an awful thing had happened.
Even after a decade, the exact point of where the body was found remains visible.
You can see that there's been disturbance at this particular location. There's a dip, and there's disturbance in the marram grass. The vegetation hasn't fully colonised. As you can see further along, we've got full colonisation. But here, we've got gaps in the vegetation where the sand is still exposed, where it was dug over 10 years ago, but it's still showing marks that there had been disturbance and digging.
It was an early afternoon. We discovered Bob's body in the shallow grave that Bob had been buried in. So that was a significant breakthrough. That was confirmation that we were searching the right area, and we were able to advise Bob's family that, whilst we couldn't formally identify the body as Bob, that we did have a body recovered in that area.
A forensic pathology report would later conclude that Bob had died of asphyxiation. However, could the shallow grave offer up more forensic evidence along with the body to tie Crummock and co-accused Jack Campbell to the crime? Working alongside a forensic archaeologist, biologist Sarah Jones was part of the team collecting crucial material that could aid the investigation.
My role there, really, in terms of forensic recovery, is to ensure that the sand that is overlaying the clandestine grave is recovered. We would normally sift through that sand because you may find small particles of evidence within the sand or within what we call the grave fill, the infill. Things like small finger bones and fingernails, along with other potential evidence that somebody may have dropped inadvertently whilst they're digging a grave. So that was the reason for bagging all the grave infill. And there was some material that we couldn't really identify whilst we were looking at it at the scene. We later passed that over to Professor Lorna Dawson and her team.
What were the mysterious fragments found at the gravesite? And could they be another vital clue to helping detectives solve the case? On the picturesque Scottish island of Sanday, police in 2009 were investigating the murder of Bob Rose, a 54-year-old Yorkshireman who'd moved to the island 18 months earlier. After being reported missing, forensic geology combined with a dramatic confession had helped find his body buried in a shallow grave amongst the dunes. Police had 2 suspects in custody, with the first, Stephen Crummock, blaming a second man, Jack Campbell, for the murder. Detectives were convinced both men had played a part in Bob's murder, and once again, fragments of forensic evidence would link them both to the crime.
Now we know for sure where Bob's body is. We can take the sand samples from that area, and we can now get Lorna Dawson to compare them to those on the Land Rover and to any other items that we recover in the investigation. Part of that was that we had found 2 spades outside Bob Rose's house.
They asked us to look at these spades to see if there was any material adhering to them. So the material that was collected from the area around where Mr. Rose was recovered from, so the grave fill, and that material, it shared all the physical, shared all the chemical, and shared all the individual particle characteristics of the sand on that spade with the sand at the Stywick site where he was recovered from.
That proved that the spades had been used to dig on the beach where Bob's body was found. But that wasn't the only evidence connecting the spades to the shallow grave.
What we also found were tiny flakes of metal which had fallen off the spade and landed in the material that was in the grave. So that showed that there was 2-way transfer. Transfer of the sand from the grave to the spade and transfer of the tiny flakes of metal from the spade to the grave.
Forensics were helping police tie the whole case against Crummock and Campbell together.
The sand on the spade helped provide evidence of who had done what at the particular locus. And that helps the whole process from the very beginning of the sand on the vehicle and the sand on the spade to bring together a case that can go to court and ultimately to bring closure for the family and friends of the victim.
The weight of forensic evidence was now enough for detectives to move the investigation on.
So having originally detained Stephen Crummock and Jack Campbell on suspicion of the murder, at the end of their interviews, we cautioned and charged them both with murder and attempting to pervert the course of justice for burying Bob's body. So they both appeared in court and they were both remanded to prison.
Jack Campbell was taken to Inverness prison. And it's from behind the high walls that detectives would receive fresh information about his role in Bob Rose's death.
Although he hadn't spoken to the police during our interviews of him and just refused to say anything to us, he actually made a confession to his cellmate in Inverness while he was on remand. And we then spoke to the witness and we included that in our case.
The case would eventually be heard, not in the Highlands, but at the High Court in Glasgow in 2010. Ian Moore represented Stephen Crummock.
This was a fascinating case and really unique in many ways, just so many different colourful characters involved. Obviously, we went to trial denying that he was guilty of murder, and he wasn't convicted of murder at the end of the trial.
Crummock instead was convicted of the lesser crime of culpable homicide.
In Scots law, we have the possibility of being convicted of murder or of a lesser alternative of culpable homicide, which means a blameworthy killing. That's the definition of it.
Ian believes that the court took into account Crummock's help when it came to locating Bob's body in the dunes at Stywick Bay.
I believe I'm right in saying that he's the only person in Scottish legal history to have admitted burying a dead body and not be convicted of murder.
For the culpable homicide conviction, Crummock received a jail term of 11 years. He served his time, but died shortly after his release from prison. His co-accused, Jack Campbell, felt the full weight of the law for his role in Bob Rose's untimely death.
Jack Campbell was convicted of murder and got a life sentence with a 16-year imprisonment. This was a great outcome for the family, a great outcome for our investigation, and just really testament to all the sort of time and effort and all the logistics that went into this.
A row sparked by jealousy and a fallout over finances ultimately led to murder. Over a decade later, the case remains something few islanders wish to discuss, but also can't fail to forget.
There only ever have been two murders in the history of Orkney. The Michael Ross case and this case. So a murder taking place anywhere in Orkney was a real shock to the community, the whole community, and very much something that everyone was fascinated by and interested in.
"12 years after the Midsummer murder on this idyllic isle, the case remains one of the most memorable for those at the heart of the investigation.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find, and you don't know whether one element is going to be a significant finding or not. Coming back here after all this time and seeing the locations where we spent a lot of our time, it is quite emotional, and I'm very proud of what we achieved as a team. We were a team of not just biology, but we had soil science, we had entomology, we had archaeology, all of the different forensic experts that participated in the inquiry and ultimately arrived at being able to piece together the circumstances, starting from nothing, really, starting from just a vehicle left at a ferry terminal and a disappearance that nobody could explain.
The forensics played an enormous part in the success of this investigation, both from a police sort of investigation point of view during the inquiry itself, linking everything together, disproving certain theories and versions of events, and actually showing us where the murder had taken place.
Forensic science is about finding facts, facts that can help the police work out what happened and help the prosecutors put the case together so that justice is done and justice is deserved for the family and for the poor victim of crime.
So to go to an island like Sandy in the circumstances we did was totally unique. These type of crimes should never happen in such a lovely, remote, close community in an idyllic setting. So it was a very surreal experience from start to finish, and it was such a rare occurrence. This has been such a major part of my policing life and those of us that were involved in it. We'll always remember Bob Rose.